Mary Anning certainly has paved the way for women in science. I wouldn't be here if she didn't take the risks that she took 200 years ago.
You could say that, and this may sound flippant, Mary has increased in popularity and been rediscovered as a consequence of people being able to see on television what a dinosaur might have looked like.
Mary and her family, their business was very much collecting fossils and selling them. They sold them as curiosities, and she herself was perhaps a curiosity as well.
Mary's story is so incredibly interesting because not only was she female, she was working class, and you just very rarely kind of hear about those kinds of female scientists. Normally when you hear about the Ada Lovelaces of the world, and they kind of come from quite wealthy and privileged backgrounds, so there's a kind of a double whammy with Mary Anning.
The obstacles that Mary had to overcome were the fact that she was a woman working in a world that was dominated by men.
When you hear about Mary Anning's struggles to be recognised, for her voice to be heard, for her position to be recognised and her contributions recorded, it's something I can relate to.
Mary wasn't purposely written out of history. It's very easy to think that there's been some sort of male conspiracy against her.
Mary Anning is a key figure in paleontology. She lived about 200 years ago in Lyme Regis, and she became extremely famous because of the fossils that she found that were being revealed by the stormy waves washing them out of the cliffs.
She lived in Lyme Regis, and she lived on the site of where we're standing now. Her house stood on the site of the museum. She was born in 1799 and died in 1847, and in her relatively short life was responsible for discovering many of the fossils that advanced our understanding of evolution and also of the age of the Earth. She was the daughter of a carpenter. Both her parents were West Country people. Life was difficult for them. The Annings had several children that they lost very young, and only Joseph, Mary's big brother, and Mary actually survived to adulthood.
Her discoveries were so significant at the time because this was 40 years before Darwin would get round to writing The Origin of Species.
Darwin often talks about the importance of the fossil record in demonstrating how creatures change, because of course the creatures that Mary discovered were all extinct. Although when they were being discovered, the conventional thought would be, if God's universe is faultless, species cannot become extinct, which means these creatures are probably living somewhere else in the world. It's just that we've never seen them. She was lucky in one respect in that she was doing the work that she did with the great skills that she possessed at the time when geology was known as a queen of sciences. It was a science from which we could learn most about the history of the Earth. Interestingly, many of the other people that were involved in geology were actually clergymen, which people always think, oh, is that right? Age of the Earth and all that. But several of the great geologists that she worked with, who were all men, all university educated, several of them were ordained, and they basically started looking at the world to discover the glory of God's creation, and then suddenly found questions that they couldn't answer. And the fossils that Mary found were the evidence that enabled people to piece together what we call deep time, the true age of the Earth.
She had such a passion for finding these extraordinary fossils in the cliffs in Charmouth, and her mission was always to prove the value of geology to wider society, why it mattered, why people should take notice.
At the time that Mary was young, because of the wars with France and because of the growth of Bath as a place to spend the summer season, lots of people used to come down to Lyme in the summer to recover from the excesses of their life in Bath. And these were people with disposable income. They were middle-class people. They stayed in local accommodation and they walked on the seafront, and they were a market there, very interested in buying fossils. So Mary's father increased his income by selling what he found onto them, as well as working as a carpenter. And Mary said many times that it was actually being out when she was very small with her father Richard that taught her all she needed to know about fossil hunting.
So Mary Anning, I think she's well known as a fossil hunter, but perhaps actually her contribution to paleontology as we know it is only really now becoming recognised. She and her brother found, at the age of 11 and 12, found the first well-known complete ichthyosaur. Fragments had been found before that, but this is the first to be known, the whole specimen. Later in her life, at the age of 23, 24, she found the first complete plesiosaur, another of these large marine reptiles.
Mary was by far the more interested of the two Anning children in fossil hunting, and she, being phenomenally intelligent and being very good at understanding anatomy and simply being a very good fossil hunter, which is a difficult thing to do, discovered the fragments of the first flying reptile found in England.
Less glamorously maybe, she was also the first to recognise that these strange stones that were found within many of the marine reptiles were in fact coprolites, fossilised faeces. And you might think, well, why are coprolites so important? But actually, as well as sort of providing entertainment for generations of children who are learning to collect fossils, they tell us huge amounts about what the animals ate. You can cut them up, you can see the scales of the fish preserved within them and understand quite a lot about the ecology of some of these large fish and large marine reptiles.
The reason why she became such a celebrated figure in paleontology is because she found fossils that were new to science at that time. The learned men of Victorian society couldn't believe it. Here was a woman who was uneducated in their eyes, inexperienced, and to top it off, she was a woman.
She was operating in a world that was very difficult for any intelligent woman who wanted to do something perhaps unconventional. But in some ways, Mary was actually assisted because she lived in a quite isolated place and she did something that was absolutely unique. She looked for fossils. There were other people doing it, but everybody knew of Mary Anning. She was quite well known in her time. The key other female fossil hunter in the town was Elizabeth Philpott. Elizabeth Philpott and her two sisters were ladies who essentially, as they hadn't married, were the responsibility of their brother. He moved them down to Lyme and set them up in a half-decent cottage because it was cheaper to keep them in Lyme than it was in London. So they were supported by their brother, but they weren't wealthy. Simply they didn't have to work. And Elizabeth and her sisters, but especially Elizabeth, took a huge interest in paleontology as well. And she's a very significant paleontologist. She found many fossilised fish. She had her own small museum in her house, and it meant that some of the geologists that visited Lyme could see fossils in her house. So she and Mary knew each other well. They were different social backgrounds, and Elizabeth was somewhat older than Mary, but they were all part of this network of science.
The Philpott sisters were interesting because they weren't working class. They were much better educated women, but they were clearly, particularly Elizabeth Philpott, they clearly were very friendly and connected with Mary, and they shared a lot of their work and a lot of their collections. And I think what that shows us in a way is that sort of those networks that Mary had, that she really built a lot of connections with people outside of her class, perhaps.
What's that?
It's an ammonite. That's its shell, and that's where its head used to be.
Why isn't it empty?
Because it's a fossil. A creature that lived millions of years ago, in deep time. You see these lines in this cliff? Well, they were made millions of years ago. I usually sell them, but you can keep that for your collection.
Mary didn't have work to continue after she died, in the sense that what she found she sold, and she wasn't somebody that wrote papers. She wasn't an academic, even though she could read the papers of others and understood what they were saying and could make contributions to them. She was just a very clever woman. But there was no real work to continue because her work was largely practical. Other people would have been finding fossils and would have been preparing them, but there was no great legacy for her to pass on. Mary is buried in Lyme Regis. Her grave and that of her brother Joseph stands alongside our church, St Michael's, 100 metres from the museum. And very close to their grave, there's an engraved window in the church, stained glass window, that commemorates Mary. But it doesn't commemorate Mary as a scientist. It commemorates Mary because she was known to be very kind and generous and looked out for people that were even less well off than she was. So her human qualities are actually marked there, and it's interesting to note that Mary was a religious woman. She went to the Baptist church in the town when she was young and then moved to the Church of England, as many people did when they became better off or their fame increased. But she had no problem at all in tying her religious faith in with the things that she was discovering on the beach.
I think it's really interesting to think about what she might have thought in terms of her religion. She was a dissenter, she was quite a regular churchgoer. But, how did she sort of, in her mind, settle the idea that these strange creatures in the rocks, how did that relate to the flood? This was a real time when lots of people were speculating and writing about that. Were these the dragons from the devil? Were these God's jokes? What were the explanations? I don't know what Mary thought, but I think it's really interesting to speculate on that.
One of the really fascinating things about how she used to educate herself was that she couldn't afford to buy all the journals and the magazines that were published, so she used to borrow them from Elizabeth Philpott and other people who would buy them, and she'd meticulously handwrite them all out, and she spent hours burning the midnight oil, writing them all out and copying all the little drawings and sketches, so she'd have her own copy. Just incredible. It just shows the real sort of the magic behind what she was trying to do.
We know that Mary had really quite limited formal education, but over the course of her lifetime she built up a really incredible knowledge and understanding of the creatures that she was finding. And we see in some of the letters, for example, there's a letter she writes to Adam Sedgwick, which is in the University Library here in Cambridge, in which she describes the specimen that she's inviting him to buy, and then she does a really detailed drawing of it. In fact, such a detailed drawing that we can identify that particular specimen from our collections. It was never associated with her name by Adam Sedgwick when he bought it, but we now know which specimen it was, and we can do that from the accuracy of the drawing that she presented to him.
It's not always easy to find the fossils that Mary discovered. They're very often in museums, and very often they're in the names of the wealthy man that donated them, who probably bought them off Mary, rather than being recognised as being found by the poor woman from Lyme Regis who found them, but then had to sell them because that was her business.
There's an interesting example here in our collections. We have two fairly similar large marine reptiles, two ichthyosaurs. One collected by Mary Anning and sold to Adam Sedgwick, and on it it's inscribed, presented to the museum by Adam Sedgwick. A second very similar specimen, also collected from Lyme Regis, was presented by a man called Thomas Hawkins, who was very much contemporary of Mary. He and Mary went fossil hunting together. He was a collector but also a purchaser. But he, perhaps with an eye to his posterity, presented his specimens with quite a fanfare, to be honest. He presented his specimens to the university. And so that specimen, on it says presented by Thomas Hawkins. His name sort of lives on that specimen now. It's only now that the sort of restitution work that we're trying to do is put Mary's name back on the specimens that she collected.
Mary Anning was in some ways fortunate in that as she was single, it meant that anything that she found, she actually owned. Were she married, all her possessions would have in those days belonged to her husband, as would all of her income. So living a quite isolated life that she did, doing something very unusual and and not being somebody's wife meant that she was in some ways a financially independent woman. But of course, she would have been prohibited from joining things like the Geological Society, as any woman would have been.
To be a woman in Victorian society and to take the challenging notion of being out in all weathers, walking those beaches covered in mud and literally grimy fingernails from scraping through the clay to find fossils. That image of womanhood in Victorian society was not accepted. And for her to break down that barrier of what women should do, what they should be, how they should behave in society, I think for a lot of women in science, that did break down barriers for what is expected from us.
I think it's really hard for young girls and women to visualise themselves doing jobs in any, not just earth sciences, in any careers where there aren't a lot of women's voices or women being visible in them, because it's kind of a subliminal thing that's been said to them that it's not for them, and then it kind of gets fed into their own kind of mindset, and I think lots of young girls and young women are turned off by that.
Ever since geology and the earth sciences was developing in the 19th century, it's been a subject, it's been a science that men have dominated. And perhaps unlike some of the other sciences, it's been very much rooted in fieldwork and that sort of sense of adventure and exploration. And indeed, lots of people would sort of stereotype a geologist as a sort of Indiana Jones figure wearing a jacket with lots of pockets in it and a sort of hat and setting out sort of against the odds into the desert to find dinosaurs. Well, we don't look like that, but I think we're still a little bit saddled with some of those preconceptions that it's about being sort of out in the wilds against all odds. And that's quite a sort of macho stereotype. And I think where we are now is that actually, of course, some people do field work, and they do field work in exciting and remote places. But lots of geologists do their geology in very different ways. We've got a really interesting exhibition here in the museum at the moment about some of the researchers in the department who work on earthquakes. And their work is entirely based on data that they analyse on the computer. They don't do field work. And I think for me that's about challenging the stereotypes of what a geologist is, but it's also saying, actually, you don't have to fit that mould. This could be something that all sorts of people could do.
When I started out in the earth sciences field about 20 years ago, that sounds like a really long time, doesn't it? There were very few women working within the field itself, but there were even fewer people of colour. So I look at this from a very intersectional lens. If I fast forward 20 years to today, I see far more women out there kind of going fossil collecting or fossil hunting or championing geosciences. So on that front, I can safely say that the face of the science from a gender perspective is absolutely changing. Where we need to do more work is to really look at enhancing more diverse people from diverse backgrounds, so we're talking about Black, Asian and minority ethnic people, to really see that the science is for them as well. This has been a particular passion for me because I've spent 20 years working in a space really where I feel like I'm the only brown face in the room. It's really quite challenging after a time, and what I would love to see is more people, particularly young people from those Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds, coming into the geosciences and the earth sciences, feeling that their voices are welcome and that they will be empowered and enabled to have fantastic careers like I have. My passion for geology didn't start, through walks of nature with my family or, watching television programs. It started with this rock here. We went back to Kenya for a family holiday when I was about 11 years old, and it was whilst walking over an ancient lava flow, whilst we were traveling from Nairobi to Mombasa, that I picked this rock up. And it's from a place called the Shaitani lava flow, and it's an ancient, craggy, sharp landscape. As you're walking over it, and I can remember this like it was yesterday, I was walking over this sharp lava rock and could feel the rocks through my very thin plimsolls. And I was thinking to myself, if this rock was real lava, bubbling hot, you know, bright orange, like the lava that's coming out in those volcanoes in Iceland today, my legs would be melting off. And I was horrified by that fact. But at the same time, I was really fascinated because I thought, this is amazing. I'm holding a rock that's literally come out from the heart of the earth. And at 11 years old, coming from a very kind of urban environment like Slough, to be transported to a world which is created by molten rock, that for me was mind-blowing. That experience was a touchstone for me to fuel my passion for earth sciences as I went through, you know, school, education system, all the way up through to studying my PhD. I find it so important as we're raising generations of young girls and women to enter these spaces where they aren't traditionally seen. We need to have those beacons of success in front of us to aim towards.
I started the Mary Anning Rocks campaign with my then 10-year-old daughter, Evie Swire, because we just felt that something needed to be done and we needed to champion Mary's name again in Lyme Regis.
When I heard about the campaign led by Mary Anning Rocks to create a statue of Mary Anning in Lyme Regis, I was immediately captivated by their energy and the uniqueness of the voice that Evie had in retelling the story of Mary Anning.
So we had been fossil hunting on the beach. Evie had been learning all about the 100 years of suffrage at school, so it was at that particular time, so this was 2018. And she had a brilliant teacher who had taught to the students about the Millicent Fawcett statue that was the first female statue in Parliament Square. So these two things had kind of fired her sort of imagination. So as we came off the beach, she said, "Oh, can we go and see Mary's statue?" You know, and I found myself again having to explain to her that women in certain times in history, didn't have the same rights as men. And as I'm kind of explaining all this to her, she got really angry, and her neck got quite blotchy and red. And I suddenly realised, I thought we should all be angry about this.
The deficit of statues of women in our society is a real indication on how society values the contributions of women. So if we don't see those women around us who have contributed to society, how can we then see it within ourselves?
When you have children and you see your children get quite passionate about something, it really makes you quite proud that they have these interests. And then when they are really crestfallen and they kind of work out that things aren't always equal, and the fact that Mary didn't have a statue really made her physically be quite angry and upset, then that really made me feel upset as well, and that I wanted to do something about it for Evie. And then we were like, well, no, let's do it together, And I said, if we're going to do this, we need to kind of have a really lovely following and kind of like have experts and advisors that are going to advise us on this. And it was Evie that said, oh, well, let's get Sir David Attenborough. And it was that kind of innocent way of like, oh yeah, let's just go and get David. And I had to explain to her, I said, he's a very busy man, he's very famous, don't get your hopes up. She said, I'm going to write him a letter. So she's 10 years old, she writes a handwritten letter, she sticks one of her little ammonites in it, just basically saying, do you think it's a good idea? It was so sweet. Do you think it's a good idea getting Mary a statue? And I, again, don't get your hopes up, you probably won't be able, and if you do get a reply, it'll probably be from his secretary, We got a handwritten letter back from Sir David within 3 days. And the letter was so lovely, and it was all about, I think it's a brilliant idea, Evie, I am behind it, put my name down as a supporter, and thank you for the ammonite, it's now the smallest in my collection. And it's her most favourite treasure of the whole, of the whole campaign, that she's now pen pals with Sir David Attenborough.
When I was at school, I studied A-level geography, and during those times when I was sitting in A-level geography lessons, we learnt about, rivers and coasts and glaciers and plate tectonics. Never once did I hear the word Mary Anning or even understand her contribution to how we now understand life on Earth. And when I went to university, I'm sure she was probably mentioned in a paleontology class that I took. But for some reason, that story didn't resonate with me then. And it's only much later, now that I've actually started to work in the field where I advocate the science to, particularly to young girls, that her story really has been brought to life for me, because through her passion and her understanding of how to communicate the value of fossils to the wider public during her time, I'm able to use that knowledge and skills in the work that I do today.
In recent years, she's been rediscovered in various ways. There's Tracy Chevalier's book Remarkable Creatures has brought to the attention of an audience that perhaps wouldn't have known about her, and her importance on the national curriculum is just delightful. We get hundreds of children come to the museum, 6 or 7 years old, who all want to be Mary Anning when they grow up. They're all obsessed with dinosaurs and they all want to go and find fossils like Mary. And that's just delightful. And we know that some of those young people, be they boys or girls, will grow up to be scientists at some stage.
We have a lot to do to change the culture in the geosciences to ensure that the space where we want these young people to come into, that it's more welcoming and it's more acceptable to who those people are. And within the work that I do, I create organisational change, particularly with the large organisations that are present within the geosciences field. And I think if Mary was here looking at that today, I think she'd be really inspired, because that is what she tried to do, particularly with learned societies like the Geological Society of London. As a woman of science at her time, she was finding all of these extraordinary fossils and saying to the learned men at the time, look at me, look at what I found. I am worthy of a place at your table. Recently I was awarded the R.H. Worth Medal from the Geological Society of London in recognition for my work promoting and educating the public about earth sciences. For me, that was a real emotional moment, because it was a recognition of 20 years work trying to help people be excited about rocks as much as I am. The reason why I feel emotional as well is because every time I walk through the doors at the Geological Society of London, I look on my left and I can see a spectacular ichthyosaur skull that Mary collected, and above that cabinet is Mary's portrait. And whenever I go through those doors, I have to offer her my silent thanks, because without her, I wouldn't even be allowed to walk through those doors.
It's so interesting to think about what Mary might have made of a female museum director, because there weren't any. None of them had those positions. And I feel incredibly privileged to be the next in that line and see, you know, and hope that I can also encourage and empower and perhaps even inspire other girls to come in and do this too.
If I was to speak to my 11-year-old self who was walking across those ancient lava fields in Kenya today, I would say follow your dream, because a job in the geosciences is a job that will help you to travel, it will help you to expand your imagination, and by that it will bring you experiences that are so unique and extraordinary. You won't get that if you become an accountant and look at spreadsheets all day. And I think one of the real magical things about a career in the earth sciences is this: you get to hold time in your hands. I don't think there's any other job that you can do where you can hold something that's 200 million years old in your hand and understand why it's there and why it matters today. And I think my advice to all those young girls out there is just follow that dream, because you can make it come true if you really do believe in yourself.